Everyone, and welcome to part one of our lecture on chapter 11, Qualitative Designs and Data Collection. So in this first part of our lecture, we're really going to dive into the different types of research designs that we'll classify as qualitative research. And then in the second part, we'll talk more about that data collection piece. So to get started, I want to just recap what qualitative research is. So remember that a lot of times when we talk about research, the broad umbrella categories that we use to describe it is quantitative research and qualitative research. And qualitative research tends to be the research that is almost sort of typically described in like undergrad psychology classes as being the research that has to do with words. And it's important to keep in mind that the reason why we have qualitative research is because some research questions cannot be answered reliably through survey questionnaires and require us to use different methods. So, historically, and sort of in just general research, a lot of people rely on surveys. You have a link that you fill out that says, here are these predetermined sets of questions that you need to answer, and they have pre selected answers, and you choose between A, B, and C. That's a survey. And what we found in research is that this doesn't always capture what we all need to understand. And oftentimes, because it doesn't capture everything that we need, we have to really rely on different methods of data collection. So, when researchers want to know what people do, not just what they say they do, researchers have to spend time observing them. And that's part of qualitative research, is engaging in that observation to get to know your participants better and to really get a feel for how they are actually behaving and not just what they say they're doing. Also, when researchers want to know how people think, not just how many people think that they are expected to think, researchers have to spend time interviewing them. We all have ideas about how we're supposed to be thinking, but how we actually think can be different from that. And the only way to capture that difference is to spend time interviewing people, talk to them, see what they are talking about, how they're thinking. And this qualitative approach presents interviewees with a shorter list of questions that allow them to give longer answers with variable content. And qualitative research allows the researcher to capture lots of data that would be missed if participants are required to select one of two answer choices on a survey. So you get more data and you get it more in depth and more really unique to the participant. And qualitative research can be used to establish categories in lesser known populations. It's important to establish categories before counting how many people fit into one category, especially when we know very little about the population that we are studying. Counting the number of people in a category is what we call quantitative research because you're looking at the numbers. But if you are establishing the types and the number of categories, that's the qualitative piece. So looking at the ways that we can classify people or classify groups of information, that is the qualitative piece. So there are two situations to consider for the basic rationale for qualitative research. The first of those is to do research in a community where you know very little about that community. We call this exploratory qualitative research. You are going in with the intention of just trying to explore what is going on in this community and trying to understand it better. We also have the idea that you can do research in a community you know a lot about, and this is confirmatory qualitative data experiments or research. So this is where you already know information and you're looking for information that will confirm or deny what you already know to be true about that community. And no matter if your research is more explanatory or more confirmatory, there are plenty of possibilities for collecting qualitative data, which is where we're going to go next. So there are various ways that you can collect qualitative data, and one of the most prominent among the qualitative designs is ethnographic designs. And this is designed typically as one of the first things that social scientists associate with qualitative research. ethnographic designs deal with people's views and values. It's getting on the ground level and asking people how they view the different situations, what they value, what they're thinking, what their beliefs are. When you're studying an unknown community, it is important to recognize that that unknown community is only unknown to you as the researcher. Because for the people who are living in that community, it's very well known to them. They know their community. So calling it an unknown community is really only true for you as the researcher who's stepping in. And also, as a researcher, if you're in that community and it's unknown to you, you might experience stress when living in this other culture, which is referred to in research as culture shock. Some of the things that people do in that community, even down to what they eat, their politics, their economy, and their environment, might seem uncomfortable to you as a researcher, but are commonplace for those in the community, which is what causes that shock, which you see in research when you are doing ethnographic qualitative research. You can also do research in a known community to learn more about it. This approach can make it easier as a researcher to want to dismiss ideas because you might feel like you already know a lot about your own community. But as a researcher, it's important to refrain from this urge to dismiss ideas and to stay open to new information that is likely different from your own. Keep in mind that people who live in the same community are likely to have vastly different experiences, and that is how you as a researcher, if you're engaging in ethnographic designs in a known community to you, you really start to get this more comprehensive view of what that community is like. You can also engage in experimental designs, which is really interesting because experimental designs are typically associated with quantitative research. Because in a traditional experiment in a lab, you as a researcher have a lot of control over the variables. And in qualitative research, you can have some experiments, but when you compare them to experimental designs that are in a lab, qualitative research is very different. One of the most closely related examples in qualitative research is ethnographic fieldwork. And in comparison to experimental designs, ethnographic fieldwork has lots of things that will intervene in daily life without the researcher being able to know all of the variables, let alone controlling them. So it's almost the opposite of an experimental design, where in an experimental design, the researcher has complete control over the environment, in theory. In ethnographic fieldwork, you don't have that. You are really in the seat of observing what these variables are that could be influencing the results that you're seeing, but also not being able to know them, let alone control them. But even in field work, there are field experiments that allow researchers to collect experimental data while in the field. And there are two common examples of field experiments. The first of those is natural experiments, which happen all around us all the time. And you can learn how to discover and evaluate these natural experiments. So for example, say you're looking at the ways that individuals' behaviors change following a legislative pass for increased recycling programs. As the researcher in this case, you don't have any control over the legislation that passed and that it is being implemented. It is being implemented outside of your control. The government or whoever the legislative body is has decided that we are going to make this change. But as a researcher, you can still measure the changes in behavior as a result of that bill passing and then see how recycling behaviors change. That's a natural experiment. Our society, our environment, our community has created this natural change that we as a researcher didn't have control over, but we can still measure the output of it. And then the second common field experiment is the naturalistic experiment. And this can be made to happen in the real world. As a researcher, we may seek naturalistic experiments because they are a balance between the benefits of retaining the real world complexity with the benefits of structure in an experimental design. In naturalistic experiments, there is a combination of natural change in the environment coupled with the researcher doing some form of manipulation or intervening in some way, and then you as a researcher get to conduct some baseline behavioral measure and see how people react. So a good example of this is if we stick with our recycling example, there's some legislation that passes around increased recycling programs. As a researcher, you don't have control over that piece. It is a natural change in our environment. But you as a researcher can engage in some control, some manipulation of variables to get a better idea of what's going on. So one way to do this is as a researcher, you get a baseline observation of your participants. See how their recycling behaviors were before the legislation passed and after the legislation passed. But then the manipulation or the control comes into place. Maybe you as a researcher pick a community and you randomly divide the community in half. You tell half of the participants that they are now being observed, that you as a researcher are going to observe how their recycling behaviors change, and you don't tell the other half. You have now created a sense of control over a variable in your experiment, and then you look to see if people's behaviors change even further if they think that they're being observed. This is an example of a naturalistic experiment where you have combined both the natural change in the environment with some manipulation and control assigned to the experiment, where you see that balance. We also have what's called comparative designs. And experiments are comparative by design because pre-test and post-test data are always compared to one another. And so there are always two groups, including the control group. That's what we see in experiments. But when it comes to non-experimental designs, there are even more possible comparisons, which is why non-experimental researchers often call their designs comparative, because they are comparing various groups and they have control over what comparisons they want to draw. Some designs will compare cases to cases, and others will construct comparisons within cases. So in qualitative designs, if you're comparing cases to cases, you might be comparing one data point, like one interviewee that you have talked to another, one member of a community to another. You're comparing them. But you can also compare across cases. So an example of this might be if you have collected data for an entire community, you want to look at how behaviors change. If we're going to stick with our recycling example, you're going to look to see how recycling behaviors change across different age groups or different socioeconomic statuses, across different genders, sexual orientation, education levels, etc. You have your choice of comparing within cases. And we also have qualitative research that can be designed as part of a process of quantitative designs. So the way that we talk about this is that qualitative designs are part of the quantitative research process, and that qualitative designs can inform theory development. When this happens, we call this process and theory design of qualitative research. And when you're engaging in process and theory designs, let's break it down a little bit further, because I think this one can get a little bit confusing by name, but in reality, it seems to make sense. So as researchers, we can collect qualitative data before we ever collect quantitative data in a study. And this qualitative data gives us the information that we need to conduct better quantitative data. So if our quantitative data is building a questionnaire with predetermined questions and answers, the reason why and how we develop those predetermined questions and answers is probably from qualitative data that we collected first. And then from that qualitative data, we can move forward and create a better questionnaire. But we could also start with a questionnaire and then continue with a subsample of informants and with some follow-up questions to get more in-depth interviews. This sort of approach of setting in and preloading in qualitative and quantitative designs with one another is really recommended in research. It's highly recommended to have this qualitative component, even if your study is mostly quantitative research. And the inverse is true. Add some quantitative components even if you're engaging in mostly qualitative research because they inform one another and it gives you more information to support the theory that you are proposing in your study. And even though it's necessary to distinguish between the two research methods, qualitative and quantitative, it is also important to examine how qualitative and quantitative approaches intersect with one another and how we should really as researchers cycle through both. We should have both components in our studies because it gives us better information. In the qualitative design, you're allowing yourself to be informed by the participants in the study about the categories that you're creating. And in quantitative designs, you really can't support your answers without giving credit to that qualitative piece that gave you really the framework that you needed for those categories. And there are some principal differences in both the setting and the design between qualitative and quantitative studies. For example, in field research, there is a more realistic picture of what's going on, but as a researcher, you have much less control. So, field research within qualitative designs is really helpful for getting an accurate representation of how people are operating in their world. But as a researcher, we have very little control over the environment. But it's also important to keep in mind that field research it can be inexpensive but costly in terms of time. So when we say that it's inexpensive, typically if you're doing field research, you're living in that environment. So that might mean that you are paying for food and you're paying for lodging, but you don't have to pay for the measurement materials that you're using or any actual like input things that you need. So you don't have to buy an MRI machine or rent it or anything like that because you're probably just interviewing people. But qualitative research and field research is expensive in time. It can cost you a lot of time to do this research. So, when we talk about qualitative and quantitative research, it's important to keep in mind that there's a continuum of design from more structure to less structure. And as a researcher, you can build structure into the research that you're doing, such as in experiments or in comparisons, which means that you spend more time designing and less time collecting data that is already structured. Or you can choose to have a more flexible design, which means that you don't have to spend as much time on the design piece and you can start collecting data without all of the details planned out, but that data will have less structure, so you have to put more effort and structure into the analysis. So, as you might expect it, on this continuum, the first example that I presented with more structure is more of what we typically expect with quantitative designs. And that more flexible design is more associated with qualitative research, and both having their own drawbacks and strengths. So that is where we are going to pause the first part of our lecture on chapter 11. Join me for the second part of our lecture where we are going to talk about data collection in qualitative designs. I will see you all in the next lecture.